Hi, everybody. Welcome to Groups Part 2. So we're going to continue talking about some ideas about groups and how groups can affect us. Specifically, we're going to talk a lot about the idea of group dynamics in the form of tragedy of the commons and other game theory type situations. So first, let's talk about this idea of tragedy of the commons. The tragedy of the commons is that when people get into the groups, they often overuse common resources for their own personal benefit, and then they don't leave enough for the entire group. So traditionally, the commons, if you hear like Boston Commons, for example, that was a big grassy area that was common to everyone. The main purpose of it, at least historically, was to have your sheep or other animals graze for their food, right? They could graze. But if everybody just lets their sheep go and eat the commons grass, right? And then everybody does that over and over again, pretty soon there's not enough grass. And then you can't feed anybody's sheep. It's the tragedy of the commons. It's the idea that we overuse resources that everybody needs to use. They're common resources, but if one individual person becomes selfish, then we overuse them. So water rights are another great example. If everybody, for example, a farmer, everybody just waters their crops with all the water from the stream, then the other people down the stream won't be able to have any water, and the wells run dry. That kind of an idea. Okay. What you see right here is actually a game that is used in scientific studies in order to get the idea of commons and using common resources and how people interact with other members of groups when they're using common resources. So in this particular game that you see in the demonstration, you see that each company, there's the Acme company and the Bolt company, and pretend that they're like a trucking company. And you have to get your stuff from your start to your destination. So what you would do is you would play against a person. So for example, you would be Acme and I would be Bolt. Well, there's a road right in the middle. It's a one-lane road. Let's assume that it's like in the middle of a mountain, right? It's a most direct path. In this particular game, each team gets a gate. And so what happens is you just choose whether or not you keep the gate open or closed. Well, the problem is if you keep your gate open and your opponent keeps their gate open, then your opponent can use the one-lane road, but you have to wait for that person to use the road, and then it's your turn. So if people are willing to wait and then take turns each time, then you can actually get more stuff to your destination. But if somebody becomes selfish, then the other person tries to retaliate, closes the gate, and then both of you have to go the long way around, and neither of you would get as much done. This is the idea of games and coming into things like game theory that's used in psychology. If we play a game like this, it teaches us about how people interact with other members of the group when we have a common resources, like in the tragedy of the commons, and other dynamics that happen in groups when we can play a game like this trucking game. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk first about this idea of social reinforcement. Social reinforcement is the idea that we learn based off of what's going on in the interaction with other members of the group. So for example, when we're talking about social reinforcement, we're talking often about a very economic approach to understanding group dynamics. That is, the assumptions include that people are interdependent. So I need you, you need me. So if I'm in terms of if I'm a seller, I need a buyer, right? You have to consume the goods, you have to pay me money, and I provide the good for you, etc. We are interdependent. Okay. People are also hedonistic. That means that they're selfish, right? They're more egoistic. They think about themselves and their own needs and wants. And if outcomes equals rewards minus cost, the idea would be how can we maximize our economic benefit in a relationship? So besides the idea of economics of buying and selling specific goods, the social reinforcement theory says we actually do this in our social relationships. So for example, in a romantic relationship, if I have a romantic relationship with my wife, then she has one with me, then we are interdependent in that interpersonal relationship. I, though, have my own individual wants, and she has her own individual wants. And so if I want to maximize the outcome, I need to make sure that I get as much as what I want without giving as much as I can, right? The idea is I want to maximize what I get and minimize what I have to spend. So, for example, if I want to make sure that I have the best out of this relationship, then I might have to, make sure that I do a little bit. I might have to remember that it's her birthday, etc. But I am going to try and get as much as I possibly can without spending as little as possible to maximize my benefits. Now, this feels really kind of selfish to a lot of people, but if you think about it, you only really get into relationships in order to get something out of it, even if that is the idea of knowing that you have this relationship partner. And so this idea of social reinforcement is based off of ideas of social learning and social exchange. The idea here is that we learn how to interact with each other, but that learning is based off an idea of I want to get as much as I want out of this. Now, examples of social learning that happen just in general are classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and some other in social learning, for example. But classical conditioning is when you keep doing something if you're rewarded, and you stop doing it if you're punished, right? That's the idea. So classical conditioning is when you associate this with an unconditioned stimulus, and you have an unconditioned response, and then that is associated with a neutral stimulus, which then becomes a conditioned stimulus. You get a conditioned response. It's Pavlov's dog, the idea of a Pavlov's dog kind of a thing. You learn new behaviors based off of what is associated with it, whether that's a reward or a punishment. Taking that one step further to operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is when you learn a new behavior based off of the reward and punishment that comes from it. So classical conditioning is when you do old behaviors due to new things. Operant conditioning is when you do brand new behaviors based off of being rewarded and punished for it. We also know, that there is something called modeling, which means that we can watch other people, like Bandura's Bobadil study, where we can watch other people and model their behavior. Now, why is this an important thing? What does this have to do with the idea of social exchange and game theory and all that stuff? Well, if you think about it, you learn how to be in a relationship with other people. And you learn it either by rewards, punishments, or by watching other people do things. You learn to predict what they're going to do and anticipate what they're going to do, and that can lead to certain outcomes that can happen based off of your relationships. So, when we're talking about this in terms of like actual behaviors, what we should be thinking about is ideas of things like social exchange theory. And the social exchange theory is going to say that we do things based off the idea of maximizing our benefits and minimizing our costs. So the outcomes is the rewards minus the costs in a social situation. So even an idea of like a friendship, for example. If you have your best friendship, then you got to make sure that it's not costing you too much, right? A cost might be in time or in emotional effort or something like that. When we see this in specific behaviors in labs, we often use something called a payoff matrix in a game kind of a situation. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to show you an example of a payoff matrix and how we use this in game theory and how we learn to interact with other people. So we're going to play the arms race. We're going to do this 3 times. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to pretend like you are a country. Okay? You are your country. You be country A, I'll be country B. And we're neighbors with each other, and we don't always get along, right? Or at least we're wary of each other. We can use our resources to either build factories or build missiles. Okay? If we build factories, then that means that we can build up our resources. That's good. If we build missiles, then we can attack each other and take their stuff. So what you see right here is we're going to play the game. This is a lot like the X's and O's game, but this time we're going to either build factories or we're going to build missiles. Now, if you build a factory and I build a factory, then that's right here. You get a payoff. This is a matrix, right? So this is the payoff in the matrix that we get. You build a factory and I build a factory, and we both get 5 billion, let's say, okay? However, if in 1 year you spend your time building factories and I spend my time building missiles, then that means at the end of the year, I get to attack you. I steal all your stuff and I get $10 billion and you get negative $10 billion. However, if you build missiles and I build factories, then the opposite happens. You get 10 and I get minus 10. If we both build missiles, then we both just attack each other and neither of us get anything. We get 0. We're going to play this over 3 years. So you get to decide, are you going to build a factory or are you going to build a missile? So go ahead and tell me what you chose. I chose to build a factory. You chose to build a factory. That means that I get 5 and you get 5. We both get 5. I chose to build a factory. You chose to build missiles. That means you get 10 and I get negative 10. Okay, time 2. And year 3. All right. So you see how this goes. What we are doing is we're learning how to interact socially with each other. Now, the idea here is that we would assume, at least according to a social exchange kind of a theory, we would assume that people are going to try and maximize their benefit. And in this case, it's pretty clear because we're talking about like billions of dollars. If I keep building factories and you keep building missiles, then you're just gonna gain and gain and gain, and I'm gonna lose and lose and lose. However, if we both build factories, then we can both at least increase at a modest amount. And overall, over time, that tends to indicate that we're going to have more money because there's a problem. If you attack me, I tend to reciprocate and not want you to attack me anymore. So we end up both building missiles, and we both end up getting zeros, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because we're worried about the loss. Now, so what this is doing is we're talking about this in terms of an economic kind of a problem, but it works in interpersonal relationships in a lot of different ways. Can you trust someone? If there's someone you didn't trust, you used to trust, and they betray you, what does that mean for the next time? How do we interact with people in a way that maximizes our benefits, that makes sure that we can use common resources in ways that will benefit everybody? So, we need to talk about the prisoner's dilemma. Probably the most famous payoff matrix is the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma is just the same as many other payoff matrices, and it's played very much like the missile game that we just barely played. The prisoner's dilemma says that you're a criminal and you have a partner who's also a criminal. You both get arrested and you get taken to separate interrogation rooms, and the police say, all right, we know that you did it. You can, if you confess and say, hey, we both did it. So let's say that you're Frank and I'm Malik, right? So if you're Frank and you confess and I confess, then we both get 10 years in jail. However, if you confess and I don't confess, then you get to testify against me in court. I'll get 30 years in prison and you will get 0. If neither of us confess, then we both end up with 3 years in jail. So you need to decide, are you going to confess or not confess? Now you'll see this very similar to X's and O's, to the thing that we just barely talked about, but the prisoner's dilemma was one of the first and probably the most famous one of these payoff matrix type games, where you have to decide, what are you going to do? Are you going to confess or not confess? So let's go ahead and play this right now. You're Frank, I'm Malik. We only get one time because it's only one time to do this. Are you going to confess or not confess? So I confessed and you did not confess. That means that you go to jail for 30 years and I go to jail for 0 years. Thanks. So you confessed and I confessed. We both go to jail for 10 years. If we would have both not confessed and just kept our mouths shut, then we would have had 3 years apiece. But too bad for us, huh? This is exactly the kind of thing that we're trying to get at. People try to make an economic choice about what's best for them, right? I'm trying to get the maximum for me with the minimum amount of cost involved. Here's another one. In this case, this is more similar to an idea of a social exchange interaction. So if you look at this, you'll realize that this is a payoff matrix, and we would use this in a game situation like we would in other things. Now you'll notice that there are two people. There's Sarah and Bob. And let's say that Sarah and Bob are a couple in this particular case, and they have to decide what they're going to do on Saturday. Well, it turns out that Bob really wants to stay home, whereas Sarah really wants to go to the game. And this payoff matrix is saying that there's possibilities for both people to have to do the different things, right? So for example, in this particular case, instead of thinking of this in terms of like points, think about it in terms of like pleasure. So if Bob chooses to stay home and Sarah chooses to stay home, then Bob's gonna like that. And Sarah is not gonna like it as much, but it's not that big of a deal. If Bob chooses to stay home and Sarah chooses to go to the game, then both people get what they want. They don't get to do it together, but they both get what they want. Sarah goes to go to the game, and Bob gets to stay home, which is what they both want to do. Sarah doesn't want to stay home, but Bob chooses to go to the game, then yeah, that's fine. He's going to like it okay. But Sarah has to stay home. She's not going to like that one, right? And then conversely, Sarah chooses to go to the game. Bob chooses to go too. Sarah's not going to like that because Sarah doesn't want to be at the game with Bob. Bob's going to complain the whole time, that kind of thing. All right? So these payoff matrices might be different depending on what the outcomes are, what people's desires are, etc. And when we interact with other people, we are making a decision about what we would benefit for them, what would be benefit for us, what would be the cost for us, and how we can maximize the benefit for everybody. Now, the commons part is that we have to share the results of whatever these decisions happen to be, because this is a social relationship. And so this payoff matrix might be different depending on the positives and negatives involved in what people do or don't want to do. There's other dilemma games that are out there. So for example, one of them is called the Dictators Dilemma. Now this is a different one. It's not a payoff matrix idea. So what happens with the Dictators Dilemma is you get two people to come into a study, and one of them is the dictator and one of them is not the dictator. You hand the dictator an envelope with money in it, and you say, okay, you get to decide, because you're the dictator, how much money you get and how much money the other person gets. So when we've done these payoff matrix type of games in the past, they'll actually use money when they do studies like this, right? They'll say, okay, well, you can decide and you'll get paid a certain amount, right? So let's say that we were playing the missile game, the missile silo game, and instead of fake billions of dollars in GDP, it was actual dollars, right? And if you got it right, you would get the literal amount of money. Well, the Dictator's Dilemma is a lot different. It just says, okay, you get to be the dictator, you don't. Here you go, dictator. Here's $50. How much should you get? How much should the other person get? What's fascinating about the Dictator's Dilemma is that people will not just steal the money if they're the dictator. They won't just take the money and go. They will often give at least a little bit of money to the other person. Now that's a problem because according to social exchange, you should do whatever you can to maximize your outcome and minimizing your cost. Well, if somebody's just going to hand you money, then you can just walk away. What people are saying here is that maybe there is a cost. Maybe people understand that if they're always selfish, then later on, maybe ideas of reciprocity will come back, the idea of reciprocal altruism. Hey, if I do something mean right now, then I might need this person later on. I want to establish that I'm a good person, a good interaction partner, and so I'm going to give some of the money away, even though I don't have to. Or Or they might say, hey, maybe the idea of being fair and kind is more important to me than 50 bucks is, or at least half of 50 bucks, 25 bucks might have to be. The ultimatum game is like the dictator's dilemma, except that the dictator chooses how much money they're going to get, right? You get this, you get that. But the other person gets to make an ultimatum and say, no, I don't accept that. The ultimatum game is the dictator compared to the other person. The dictator says, all right, we'll split it this way. But the other person gets to veto and say, no. And if that person says no, then nobody gets anything. So think about this. Let's say that you were playing this ultimatum game, and I was a dictator, and I say, okay, I think that that there's 50 bucks here. I think that I should get 40 and you should get 10. Under the ultimatum game, you can say yes or no. You only play this once, generally. And so what that would mean is that you would get 10 bucks that you didn't have before, and I would get 40. Often, though, you'll notice that people will say no. Because this is so unfair, I would rather both of us get 0 than you get $40 and I get $10. That is the ultimatum game. And so, again, the dictator's dilemma and the ultimatum game, they find that people don't act particularly rationally. If you show up to a place and somebody gives you 10 bucks that you didn't have before, then you're up 10 bucks. Take the money. But people will often say, no, I don't want that, just because I feel it's unfair. It's not equitable. It seems that when we socially think about the ideas of interacting with other people, it's more than just pure economics. There seem to be other factors that also play, including ideas of, feeling like a good person and feeling like you're a good partner or a kind person, or feelings of fairness and equity, even when the unfairness would benefit you. Okay. Social learning theory, according to Batson and Powell, has probably come closer to the goal of accounting for most facts with the fewest principles than any other theory in the history of social psychology. What they're saying is that often we think about ourselves as more than just economics. But if you take these things that are not, normally economics, like liking, love, helping, those kind of things, but you put them in economic terms, it turns out that a lot of that can really explain a lot of what we do. We try to benefit ourselves. We try to minimize our costs. Now, sometimes benefiting ourselves means getting more money, and cost means literal cash. But sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes the benefits are a feeling that you get, a knowledge that you're a good partner, a knowledge that somebody will be there for you. And sometimes the costs are things like time or emotional caring instead of things like money. And according to Batson and Powell, at least, those theories can really predict how we interact with each other on a social level. The social value orientation is a personality trait. It's saying that some people have different orientations as to how they interact with other people. So some people just in their personality are more cooperative. Some people are more competitive. Some people are more individualistic. They're going to think more about their individual self. And the opposite of that would be collectivistic. They'd think more of the collective or the group. So some of these things, it's not like all humans are exactly the same. Some people are going to be more likely to be cooperative. Some are more likely to be competitive, individualistic, etc. So there are some nuances of this. Remember, Levine's field theory says that behavior is a function of the person by the situation. Well, this would be the person part, right? This would be the personality traits that would help dictate the behavior. This leads us to an idea of what's called behavioral economics. Behavioral economics is part of economics, not part of psychology, but guess what? It's psychology. So behavioral economists used to think very much in terms of markets, that idea that, maximize the cost, rewards, et cetera, and that people are going to act rationally. Well, what they found is that behaviorally, sometimes people don't act particularly rationally. So, for example, the ultimatum game says that if somebody's going to give you 10 bucks that you didn't have before, it doesn't matter if it's fair or not, you should take the 10 bucks. But humans are a little bit different than that. So there's a new branch of economics, which is really just psychology applied to more economic types of things. So a behavioral economist might go through a lot of the stuff that we've talked about. Richard Thaler is a very famous economist who is a behavioral economist. He won the Nobel Prize, for example. And so behavioral economics is really growing in the field of economics, saying that people don't always act rationally according to the ideas, or at least the traditional ideas of economics. There are other factors involved that are important to humans. This, conversely, has really influenced the way that social psychologists are thinking about things as to whether or not we can identify behaviors in terms of a social exchange, benefiting, maximizing our outcomes, minimizing our costs. That's it's an exchange that's going on. It's a give and take that's going on between economics and psychology right now. This brings us to ideas of negotiation, which is kind of a bridge between this. So, for example, I was at the University of Maryland, and one of my colleagues there, Michelle Gelfand, is a very famous psychologist, industrial organizational psychologist, which is like social psychology applied to business and groups. And one of her fields of study is negotiation. One thing that we need to make sure that we understand is that negotiations are often seen, at least in the United States, as a zero-sum game, right? There's a winner and there's a loser to different negotiations. But in reality, most negotiations can actually find benefits for both parties. And there's a lot of different scenarios that give both people at least some, if not all, of what they want. And in many cases, both people can get all of what they want. It's not like there's this set amount of the pie and you get some and I get some, and we're trying to figure out who gets the most. Often when in negotiation, we can find ways that you get what you want, I get what I want, and we're both happier than we were before. All right, thanks everybody.